There's a kind of silence that doesn't come from peace. It comes from knowing you've asked the same question 100 different ways and never gotten an honest answer. That silence settled over our kitchen like dust that morning. The kind that clings to the corners of your thoughts, refusing to be brushed away. I was standing at the sink rinsing the same mug I'd already washed twice. The house was still. Too still. Sadie had already gone to school and Colin was exactly where he always was these days. Everywhere but here. I stared out the window. The backyard was still brown with winter. Only a few stubborn patches of snow hung on in the shadows of the fence. There used to be a swing back there. Colin built it when Sadie was 3. He even carved her initials into the wood. Now the rope was frayed, the seat tilting sideways in the cold wind. That swing used to be his favorite thing to show off when guests came over. Handmade, he'd say, pulling Sadie into his lap like he was the kind of father who stayed. But lately, he didn't stay. Not for dinner. Not for bedtime. Not even for the silence. He was always held up at work or meeting a client or just needed some air. And maybe the first dozen times I believed him. But that morning when his phone buzzed on the counter and I saw the name Delia pop up, I didn't open it. I didn't need to. Because a woman knows. She knows when her husband doesn't flinch at the thought of disappointing her anymore. I dried my hands slowly. No rush, no rage. Just quiet. It was a different kind of quiet than before. Not desperate. Not searching. But the kind that comes when something inside you finally breaks clean. The kitchen clock ticked. I looked up at it like it might tell me what to do next. But all it did was count seconds I'd never get back. Colin came home around 9 that night, not late enough to claim he'd worked overtime. Not early enough to suggest he missed being home. I heard his keys drop into the bowl by the door. The soft creak of his shoes as he slipped them off. He didn't call out my name. He never did anymore. I stayed seated at the kitchen table, one hand on my tea, the other resting on the back of Sadie's sketchbook. She'd left it open to a drawing she made that morning. 2 stick figures. One had a tie and no face. The other held a red balloon and smiled. She told me the balloon was a heart. But she never said who the people were. Colin walked in. Didn't glance at the sketchbook. Didn't ask about Sadie. Didn't notice my tea had gone cold. He just went straight to the fridge, cracked open a sparkling water, and stood there drinking like the kitchen was empty. "You had dinner?" I asked. It wasn't really a question. He nodded. Still didn't sit. Still didn't meet my eyes. That used to hurt. Now it just confirmed things. "Sadie asked if you were coming to her choir show Friday," I said. He winced slightly. Or maybe I imagined it. "I might be in Palo Alto," he muttered. I didn't ask why. Didn't press for details. Because the last time I did, he said, "God, Janelle. You make everything feel like an interrogation." So now I don't ask. I just catalog. Mentally, quietly. The way women do when they stop waiting for the truth and start building their own. He finally sat across from me. Rubbed his temples like he was the tired one, then looked at me briefly. "You okay?" he asked. And I almost laughed. Because it was such a rehearsed line. He didn't care for the answer, only for the absence of confrontation. "I'm fine," I said calmly. Which was true. In a way, I hadn't been in months. Because fine didn't mean happy. Fine meant quiet. Fine meant I was done reaching across a distance he no longer noticed. He leaned back relieved, and I realized. He didn't see the shift, didn't feel the thread snapping. Because in his mind, as long as I wasn't crying, he hadn't done anything wrong. But I wasn't crying. I was preparing. That night after Colin went to bed, I stayed downstairs. Not because I couldn't sleep, but because I no longer wanted to try beside someone whose back always faced me. I cleaned the kitchen even though it was already clean. Reorganized the spice rack. Wiped the counters twice. It's funny how women will scrub a house when they can't scrub out the ache. At 11:47 his phone buzzed again. This time I did look. Not because I wanted to confirm anything. But because I knew. And there's a strange kind of power in letting your heart finally name what it already suspects. Delia. See you Tuesday. Same place. Missed you. No emojis. No pictures. Just intimacy in its most dangerous form. Boredom laced with routine. He had a schedule for this. A time. A place. Like a dentist appointment. I didn't cry, didn't throw the phone, didn't wake him to scream, "Who the hell is she?" because I already knew what he'd say. "She's just a friend." You're being paranoid. We haven't slept together if that's what you're fishing for. And maybe that's the cruelest part. When a man cheats with convenience but lies with conviction. I poured myself another cup of chamomile tea and sat at the small table by the window. The moonlight hit the floor in a soft slant. The fridge hummed. And somewhere upstairs, Colin shifted in bed like his conscience had found a comfortable pillow. My wedding ring felt heavy. Not in weight, but in history. In all the nights I waited for him. In all the mornings I tried to pretend we were okay. In all the weekends I kept things normal for Sadie. I twisted it once, twice, then took it off and placed it beside my mug. The metal left a faint indent on my skin like a shadow that didn't want to let go. I thought of Sadie's sketch again, the faceless figure with the tie. And I wondered if deep down she'd already seen what I spent years trying to deny. Sometimes the truth doesn't break you. It frees you. And that night in the stillness of our kitchen, I quietly chose freedom not in action but in decision. The next morning I found Sadie sitting on the couch with her cereal bowl balanced on her knees. She had pulled my sweater over her pajamas, the big gray one with the frayed cuffs. It swallowed her whole. I stood in the doorway for a moment watching the light hit her cheek just right, like she was made of mourning. She looked up at me. "Dad already left," she said, voice soft. I nodded. "He said he had a meeting," I offered. She didn't respond. Just stirred her cereal slowly, watching the loops of oat swirl like tiny buoys in milk. Then she asked Mom, "Do people stop loving each other quietly?" It stopped me cold. Not because of the question, but because of the way she asked. Not accusing, not afraid. Just curious. Like she was cataloging things in that big brain of hers. I walked over, sat beside her. Ran my fingers through her curls. Sometimes I said, "It doesn't always happen loudly. Sometimes it's like a light slowly fading. And people don't notice until it's dark." Sadie was quiet for a while. Then she said, "I don't want that to happen to us." It broke me. But I didn't show it. "We're okay, baby," I whispered. "Me and you, we're more than okay." She leaned into my side, still clutching the bowl. And I held her tighter than usual. Because even if Colin didn't notice what he was losing, I saw clearly now what I had to protect. My daughter, my peace, my dignity, and maybe love too, but not the kind that begged to be noticed. The kind that lived in quiet gestures. In holding a child through the ache. In making breakfast even when your heart is hollow. Later that day I drove Sadie to school. Watched her walk into the building with that oversized backpack and one shoe untied. Then I sat in the car for a long time after the engine stopped. Didn't cry, didn't pray, didn't make a list. Just sat there staring at my hands like they belonged to someone ready to build a different life. It's strange how silence changes its shape when you know what someone's hiding. Colin didn't act different. Not really. He still made his coffee in the same brown mug. Still wore the same crisp shirts with the cuffs rolled just so. Still asked Need anything before heading out the door. But now, I heard the spaces between his words louder than the words themselves. Every pause, every glance at his phone, every little forgot to mention felt like another whisper I wasn't supposed to hear. I didn't confront him. Not yet. Instead, I watched. I let him talk about work, about traffic, about the price of gas. I nodded at the right moments. Laughed when expected. Cooked dinner like always. But something inside me had turned. Not angry. Not broken. Just awake. One night, I packed up Sadie's lunch for school and noticed the fruit bowl was empty. I asked Colin to grab apples on his way back from work. He said sure, smiled, kissed my cheek, then came home without them. Forgot, he said, tossing his keys in the bowl. He pulled off his tie, walked past me, and sat on the couch. That's when I realized he hadn't forgotten. He had simply chosen not to remember. Because things that weren't important to him no longer lived at the front of his mind. That night after he fell asleep, I scrolled back through his texts again. Not to torture myself, but because I needed to know how many times I'd been made small in private conversations I was never meant to read. Janelle's been distant lately, he wrote once. Hard to talk to. Feels like a ghost in the house. A ghost. That's what I was to him. Not a partner. Not a woman raising his child, folding his shirts, carving herself smaller every year so his dreams could have room. Just a ghost. And I realized something then. Maybe I had been fading, but not because I was cold. Because I was tired of holding up a house built on half-truths and calling it home. On a rainy Tuesday, I pulled out the old photo box from the hallway closet. It had been years since I looked inside. Not because I forgot it was there, but because some memories feel heavier than grief. The lid creaked a little. Dust curled up like ghosts from a forgotten attic. Inside were photos, ticket stubs, little scraps of a life I once thought was solid. There we were at the pumpkin patch in Vermont, Colin holding Sadie on his shoulders. My arm wrapped around his waist like it meant something. I stared at the picture for a long time. My smile was real. So was his. But that was the thing I couldn't tell when the shift had started. There was no argument. No betrayal I could circle with a red pen, just a slow, quiet erosion. It began with him choosing his phone over conversation. With him skipping dinner saying he'd already eaten. With me not mentioning the missed birthdays because I didn't want to sound needy. I used to defend him to my friends. He's just busy. He's tired. It's not a big deal, but it was. Every missed dinner was a missing brick. And now our house was filled with drafts. I found a note I wrote him years ago on a sticky pad stuck inside one of Sadie's storybooks. It read, "Love you. Don't forget to grab milk. Day J." J simple, small, tender. And suddenly I wondered when was the last time I left him a note, or the last time he left one for me. We had stopped doing the little things that held the big things together. That night I made tea and sat by the window watching the streetlights blink through the rain. Sadie was asleep. The house was quiet, and Colin was still at work, or so he said. I didn't check, didn't need to. Because deep down I already knew where he was. Or worse, who he was with. But I also knew something else. I wasn't that woman in the photo anymore. The one who smiled without wondering what would break next. He had changed. Not hardened. Just clarified. Like glass finally wiped clean. And I started to realize maybe that wasn't the end of love. Maybe it was the beginning of seeing things as they truly were. I wasn't planning to see anyone that day. I'd run out of dish soap and decided to walk to the corner store. No makeup, no rings. Hair in a half-hearted bun that had seen better mornings. The cashier was new, young, polite. But it was the voice behind me that made me turn. Janelle, it was Evan Kessler. We'd gone to college together. Same philosophy class years ago. I hadn't seen him since before Sadie was born. He still had that crooked smile. Still wore scuffed leather shoes like he walked too far in them before realizing they needed rest. Wow. You look like life's been real, he said, then laughed like he regretted how honest that sounded. I laughed too. Because it was true. We stepped outside and he offered to walk with me. Just a few blocks. Just catching up. I didn't talk about Colin. He didn't ask. Instead, we talked about things that didn't demand pain. Favorite old books. How cheap coffee tastes better at 2 a.m. What it means to feel invisible, especially in your own kitchen. That last part slipped out of me. He looked over and said, Janelle, you've always had this light. Even when you didn't know it. I didn't cry. But my chest tightened like something inside had just remembered how to breathe. We stopped at the corner near my house. He didn't push for anything. Didn't linger. Just said, "Whatever you're carrying, I hope you remember you're not built to disappear." Then he smiled again, the kind of smile that doesn't want anything from you, and walked away. I stood there for a minute, hands still holding the plastic bag with dish soap, but heart suddenly feeling too big for my ribs. It wasn't Evan I needed. It wasn't even the kindness. It was the reminder that I existed, that I was still seen, and that maybe, just maybe, I had been spending too long in rooms where no one looked up when I entered. The kitchen light was still on when I walked in. Colin was at the stove stirring something in a pan. The smell of garlic and onion filled the air, comforting, familiar, almost enough to fool me into thinking this was still a home. He turned around and said, "Didn't think you'd be out this late." I glanced at the clock. It was barely 7:20. "I needed a walk," I said, placing the grocery bag on the counter. "Ran into someone from college." He raised an eyebrow. "Old friend." I didn't answer right away. Then softly I said, "Someone who remembered who I was." Colin blinked. Not in surprise, more like discomfort. "I made your favorite," he said, changing the subject. "Pasta primavera, the way I used to like it 5 years ago. Before I stopped eating dairy. Before I started eating alone." I sat down at the table. The fork felt heavier than usual. Across from me, Colin talked about a new client. A marketing deal. Something about numbers and expansion and being tired of the same faces. I nodded where it felt polite. Smiled when expected. But I didn't ask follow-up questions. I didn't offer stories of my day to match his. Instead, I just watched him. The curve of his hand around the wine glass. The way he laughed at his own jokes. And I wondered, when had he stopped looking at me like I was real? Midway through his story, he noticed my silence. "You okay?" he asked. I set my fork down gently. "Colin," I said, "do you ever miss me, the me I used to be?" He paused. Then gave me a crooked smile, the kind you give when you want to be kind but not honest. "You're still her," he said. But I wasn't. And he knew that. After dinner, he kissed my cheek and went to his office. He didn't notice I hadn't finished my plate. Didn't notice the tear I wiped when I thought he wasn't looking. But he did pause at the door. And for a moment, he turned back as if to say something. But nothing came. And in that silence, I realized something colder than betrayal. He wasn't afraid of losing me. Because he didn't think I had anywhere else to go, but oh, he had no idea who he was sitting across from anymore. It started with a scent. Not the lingering warmth of garlic from the night before. Not the detergent I always used. Not even my own perfume, though I hadn't worn it in months. Number. This was different. Something floral. Sweet but not gentle. Sharp, almost defiant. A kind of smell that announced itself before asking permission. It was on Colin's coat. I noticed it when I went to hang it by the door. He'd forgotten to take it with him. It wasn't cold outside, but he always wore a jacket, said it made him look more put together. I held it for a moment. The fabric was familiar. The scent wasn't. I brought it closer. And my chest tightened. It wasn't mine. Wasn't ours. I knew that kind of perfume. Not the brand, but the intention. It was the sort of fragrance you wear when you want someone to remember you. When you want to leave traces on fabric, on skin, on the spaces between conversations. Colin had never liked perfume. He used to complain it gave him headaches. And now there it was, soaked into the collar of the man who used to lean into my neck and say, "I love that you never wear anything fake." I stood still in the foyer for a long time. Just me. And the coat. And the sudden sharp sense that I had been missing something. I didn't cry. Not then. Instead, I walked to the kitchen, opened the drawer by the fridge, and pulled out a notebook. The kind I used for grocery lists and school forms. But this time I wrote something different at the top, things that don't add up. And beneath that, the first entry, Colin's coat smelled like someone else. That was all. Just one line. But it felt heavier than the whole house. Not because I needed proof. Not because I was ready to accuse, but because finally I'd stopped pretending I didn't notice. And in that moment, I remembered something Evan had said just days ago. You're not built to disappear. So I didn't. I started watching. I started listening. And I started remembering everything Colin thought I'd forgotten. I didn't confront him. Not yet. I didn't slam doors or throw accusations. Instead, I started writing more things down. The notebook lived in the kitchen drawer between the old batteries and the masking tape. I'd pull it out when he was in the shower. When he ran to grab the mail. When he mumbled something about working late again. He changed his phone password. Used to be our daughter's birthday. Now it was something I didn't recognize. 12 digits long. Secure. Like he was locking something in. He bought a new shirt. Not his usual type, this one had pearl buttons. Still had the creases from being folded in a gift box. When I asked, "Where'd you get that?" he blinked like I'd caught him mid-lie, then said, "Oh, I grabbed it on sale last week." Colin didn't grab things. He made spreadsheets for groceries. He started showering before dinner. He never used to. Said he liked to end the day still smelling like effort, but now he came home already clean. Like the day had been wiped off him. Receipts disappeared. No more crumpled gas station slips. No random coffee shop loyalty cards. His car, once a rolling archive of paper, now spotless. He thought I wouldn't notice. Maybe because I used to be so trusting. Maybe because I used to be too tired. Or maybe because he believed I was still the same woman who stopped asking questions when the answers started sounding like silence. But I wasn't. I started watching how he smiled when he texted. How he closed his laptop the moment I entered the room. How he started calling me Jay instead of baby or love. At first, I thought maybe I was imagining it all. Maybe grief made me paranoid. Maybe motherhood made me sensitive. But no, I wasn't imagining. I was waking up. Waking up in the same house with the same man, in a marriage that suddenly felt like a play he was performing in, while I sat in the front row quietly realizing the curtain had already dropped. I didn't need proof. But I needed peace. There's a difference. Proof is about them. Peace, that's about you. So I did one thing. Just one. I waited until Colin left for his consulting dinner with that same navy blazer he only wore for special occasions. No tie. Just enough effort to impress, not enough to look like he cared. I didn't cry, didn't text, didn't pace. I opened his laptop. It was there on the counter. Still warm from his hands. He'd logged out. Of everything. Banking. Email. Even the web browser had been cleared, but his calendar was open. He must have forgotten. There it was, Thursday, 7:00 p.m., per milliampere Raquette Grill, table for two, under Halston wasn't our name. I stared at it for a moment. Not because I was shocked, but because of how precise it was. Like a script, like a habit, like something that had been done more than once. I copied it down. Closed the laptop. Didn't touch anything else. That night I didn't wait for him to come home. I curled up with Sadie on the couch. Watched an old cartoon from when I was a kid. When she fell asleep with her head on my lap, I just sat there stroking her curls, thinking, if I go there Thursday night and I see what I already know, what will change? Not the betrayal. Not the facts. Not the man. But maybe me. Maybe the way I walk. Maybe the way I stop whispering in my own life and start speaking like someone who remembers she exists. I wasn't planning revenge. Wasn't plotting some grand scene. I just wanted to look. To let my own eyes finally tell me the truth my heart had carried alone for too long. Thursday came. And I didn't hesitate. I wore a soft green blouse. The one I bought last spring but never had the courage to wear. Too bright, I told myself. Too visible. Tonight I needed to be visible. I parked across the street from Marquette Grill right on time, 6:58 p.m. The patio lights were already glowing. Candles flickered on linen-covered tables. I waited. At exactly 7:03 he walked in. Colin. Hair freshly cut. That navy blazer. No wedding ring. And behind him, she was younger. Not dramatically, but enough to notice. Her laugh came too quickly, like she was trying to prove she belonged there. They were seated by the window. Corner table, one wine glass. Two menus. His hand touched hers, brief, confident. I didn't cry. Didn't flinch. Didn't turn away. I just stood there. On the other side of the glass. Where the lies couldn't fog the view. He didn't see me. Neither did she. And that was the part that hurt most. Not the affair, not the secret. But the fact that I had become invisible to the man I once gave every part of me. I could have stormed in. Could have called his name, but I didn't. I just stood still, breathing. There's a kind of power in silence when you're not silenced by fear but by knowing. Knowing this chapter was closing, knowing this wasn't about her. Knowing he hadn't broken me, he'd simply revealed who he always was. After a moment, I turned and walked away. Back to my car, back to my child, back to myself. Because I realized something. You don't always need an audience to reclaim your worth. Sometimes you just need a window, a moment, and the strength to walk away before they ever get the chance to explain. I didn't say anything the next morning. Not to him, not even to myself. There was no dramatic speech. No suitcase by the door. No broken dishes. Just silence. But a different kind this time. Not the silence of swallowing my worth. The silence of planning. I woke up early, made coffee for one. Poured it into my favorite mug, the one with the tiny crack near the handle, just enough to notice, but not enough to break. Colin stumbled in around 2 a.m. I heard the door. He didn't bother tiptoeing. He never did. He smelled of wine. Of something floral that wasn't my perfume. But I stayed in bed. Eyes open. Heartbeat steady. That morning while Sadie colored on the living room floor, I opened my laptop, and I looked at our bank accounts. Not his. Ours. Because for all the secrets he kept, Colin never thought to hide the finances. It was all there. The monthly transfers, the hidden dinners labeled as client meals. Even the hotel charges from nights he said he was working late. It didn't surprise me. What surprised me was how calm I felt. As if the shock had expired. And now I was just sorting through ashes. I started making a list. Not a revenge list. Not a list of what he owed me. A list of what I still had, of what was mine. What I had forgotten was mine. My name. My daughter. My degree. My quiet mornings. My ability to start over if I choose. I didn't feel brave yet. Didn't feel strong, but I felt awake. And that was new. Sadie looked up at me. Are we gonna go to the park today, Mom? I smiled. Yeah, baby. Just give me 5 more minutes. She nodded and went back to her crayons. I sat there, coffee cooling list growing. And in that moment I realized, maybe you don't have to burn bridges. Maybe you just stop walking across the ones that lead you nowhere. I started with the spice cabinet. It sounds silly maybe, but that cabinet had always been his space. Colin was the one who cooked elaborate meals when we had guests. The one who lined up jars alphabetically. Cumin. Dill. Fennel. I meanwhile was the one scrubbing pans afterward. Clapping politely when everyone praised his lamb chops. This morning, I opened that cabinet, stood in front of it for a full minute and thought, I don't even like lamb. I tossed half the jars. The ones I didn't use, didn't recognize, didn't buy. I wiped the shelves, lined them with plain parchment paper, and rearranged the few I knew I'd actually use. Paprika. Garlic powder. Cinnamon for Sadie's French toast. When Sadie came in, she wrinkled her nose. It smells different. It's cinnamon, I said. You like that, right? She nodded. I made her toast. And I made a second cup of coffee for myself. No eggs for Colin. No plates left warm on the stove. No note saying, hope your day goes well, just toast for my daughter and quiet for me. After breakfast, I tackled the coat closet. The drawer by the front door. The basket of unmatched socks in the laundry room. I wasn't purging. I wasn't making a statement. I was just reclaiming my space. One drawer at a time. At noon, Colin texted, client lunch ran long. Back by 3. I didn't answer. Not because I was trying to be cold, because I had nothing to say. Because I was finally learning that not every message deserved a reply. Around 2:30 I changed the sheets on our bed, not because they were dirty, but because they didn't feel like mine. They smelled like detergent he liked. A brand I never chose. So I pulled out the soft yellow set from the back of the linen closet. The one my mom gave me years ago. Still folded neatly. Still waiting for a time when I'd feel like myself again. I tucked the corners. Smoothed out the top. And sat there quietly watching the way the afternoon sun slid across the fabric. That's when it hit me. You don't have to scream to leave. Sometimes you just stop folding his shirts, and you start folding yours. I hadn't been to my mother's house in over a year. Not because of anger, just a slow drift. 1,000 little disappointments we never named. She never liked Colin. She never said it directly. But every visit ended with some version of "you sure you're happy, baby?" And I always nodded too fast, hugged her too quick, left before dessert. That afternoon, though, I found myself parking in front of her house, palms sweating on the steering wheel. She opened the door like she'd been waiting. Not surprised, not dramatic. "Thought you'd show up eventually," she said. And stepped aside. Her kitchen smelled like peach tea. Like Saturdays when I was 11. "Sadie's at a sleepover?" she asked gently. I nodded. "And Colin's?" "Somewhere." We sat across from each other. No big speeches, no tears. She poured tea, handed me a sugar cookie wrapped in wax paper from the bakery I loved as a kid. "You used to eat these with your whole face," she smiled. I laughed. "I probably still do." There was a pause. Then, quietly, "You know," she said, "I stayed with your dad 10 years longer than I should have." I looked up. "Thought I was doing it for you," she shrugged. "Turns out, you saw everything I tried to hide." That hit harder than I expected. Because it was true. I'd seen the way he disappeared emotionally. I'd seen her fold into herself quietly like a letter no one wanted to open. And now, I was doing the same. She reached across the table, rested her hand on mine. "It's not too late to write a different ending." Not advice, not pressure. Just an opening. I didn't cry. But I did exhale something I hadn't realized I'd been holding. A grief I hadn't named yet. That afternoon I left with a half-dozen cookies. A scarf, she said, made me look like spring, and a quiet kind of courage. Sometimes coming home isn't about who's waiting on the porch. It's about realizing you're still welcome even when you forgot how to knock. The house was silent when I returned. Sadie wouldn't be home until Sunday. And Colin hadn't texted all day. I walked into our bedroom. No, my bedroom. For the first time in years, it felt like the right way to think of it. I opened the closet, stood there, hand resting on his side shirts, pressed ties, color-coded. He always liked order, so did I. But tonight, I needed a different kind of clarity. I started with the bottom drawer, shoes I never saw him wear. A watch box I gifted him 5 Christmases ago, still pristine. Receipts from hotels out of town. I didn't open them. I didn't need to. I folded what I could. Left a pile by the hallway door. No anger, just purpose. The photo on the dresser, the one of us on our honeymoon in Asheville, I picked it up slowly. We were both younger. He was kissing my temple. I was smiling like I believed it all. I set it face down in the drawer. Not out of spite, just done. Then I reached under the bed for the spare linens, took out the soft gray set Sadie loved. I changed the sheets, fluffed the pillows. Opened the window just an inch, letting in the scent of pine from the backyard. The room looked lighter, like it could breathe again. I stood there in the doorway for a long time, hands at my sides. No music. No tears. Just the quiet understanding that I was rebuilding something. Not in revenge. Not in haste. In truth. My truth. As I turned off the light, I whispered to no one in particular. "We'll be okay, I promise." And for once I believed it. I heard the garage door before I heard his footsteps. Colin always parked with a thud as if even his returns had to make an entrance. I didn't get up. I stayed at the kitchen table cutting up an apple drizzling honey like I always did for Sadie's after-school snack, but today the plate was just for me. He walked in with that usual mix of tension and charm, tie-loosened sunglasses still on as if he hadn't quite decided what role to play yet. "Hey," he said, casual. I looked up, met his eyes, held them. "Hey." He glanced around. I saw it flicker across his face, the missing coat from the hook, the bare space on the mantel where our anniversary photo used to be. "What's going on?" he asked. I wiped my hands slowly, took a sip of water. Everything in my body wanted to shake, but I was still. Very still. I cleared out some things I said. Needed air. His brow knit. Confusion, not guilt. That was always the tell. Air. I stood. Walked to the sink. Didn't look at him when I spoke next. "You can have the guest room tonight." He scoffed. The guest room. Silence. "I pay for this house," he added, voice rising a notch. And there it was, the old script. Control through logistics. Ownership through paycheck. I turned. Met his eyes again, and I built it, I said. Every nail, every dollar, every choice. I made it a home. He opened his mouth. Closed it. Tried again. "Janelle, what is this?" I stepped closer. "This is me. Not fighting you anymore." He blinked. Like he didn't know what to do with peace. And that's when I knew he never feared my anger. He feared my indifference. Janelle didn't scream. She offered no proof. But the absence of familiar things, the photo, the shirt, was a quiet warning. Colin didn't know yet a truth was waiting for him in the next chapter, one that needed no words, only the look in his daughter's eyes. The school bus sighed to a stop out front. Sadie's sneakers hit the porch with her usual uneven rhythm, one lace always untied. She opened the door with a breathless mom. Then she froze. Colin turned. Their eyes met. It was just 2 seconds. But I saw it. That flicker in her face. The half smile that didn't finish forming. The way her backpack slipped halfway off her shoulder before she caught it. "Hi, Daddy," she said. Too polite, too distant. He stepped forward like always, arms slightly open, expecting the same old hug. But Sadie sidestepped, walked to the counter, and picked up a slice of apple from the plate I made earlier. She chewed, then asked, "How long are you staying?" His face twitched. "Just for tonight," I answered. Colin glanced at me, then back at her. "Hey, pumpkin," he tried. "You missed me." She didn't answer. Just took another bite. "Sadie," I said gently, "can you take your snack to your room for now?" She nodded. Didn't argue, didn't stomp, just left. Her small feet padded upstairs, then silence. Not the kind that says peace, the kind that says something has changed. Colin blew out a breath. "That was cold." "She's not cold," I replied. "She's cautious." He looked genuinely thrown. "You think I wanted this?" Any of this? I didn't respond. Because wanting wasn't the point anymore. He rubbed his jaw. Paced. "She's just a kid." And yet she noticed. His shoulders slumped. "You've been talking to her about us?" "No," I said. "She asked me if I still cry at night." I didn't have to tell her anything. His mouth opened. But again nothing came out. You can't argue with a child's observation. Sadie didn't cry, she wasn't angry. But it was the silence, the averted gaze, that became the indictment. Colin began to realize what he was losing wasn't Janelle, it was the trust of a small soul he once believed would always be his. Colin sat at the kitchen table, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee mug like it might give him the answer. I didn't sit. I stood by the window watching a squirrel twitch its way across the fence line. Even it looked more sure-footed than the man behind me. "You know, I said I used to think I wasn't enough." Colin didn't respond. "I thought maybe if I lost 10 pounds, or made your favorite dinners more often, or didn't fall asleep putting Sadie to bed, maybe then you wouldn't have drifted." Still nothing. But I heard the shift in his breathing. I was wrong. He looked up. His voice was rough. "You weren't wrong." "Yes," I said quietly. I was. I turned toward him, met his eyes, because it was never about me not being enough. It was about you never choosing to grow up. His lips parted then shut again. You had a wife who showed up, I said. Not flashy, not dramatic, just there. Every morning, every lunchbox, every nightlight. I crossed the room slowly, laid a single folder on the table. Inside were papers. Not legal threats, not custody documents, just the truth. Bank statements. Text messages I hadn't mentioned before. The timeline. Don't worry, I added, there's no lawsuit coming. No scandal. I'm not interested in dragging this out. Colin opened the folder with shaking hands. I walked to the door. Wait, he called after me. I turned halfway, but didn't step back. I'm not angry anymore, I said. I'm tired. And tired women don't yell. We rebuild. He stood up, chest rising fast. What are you saying? I'm saying, I said calmly. You can keep your image, your freedom, your clean shirts, but you don't get to keep us. His shoulders dropped. Not a dramatic collapse. Just a quiet understanding. The kind of collapse that happens inside when a man realizes he's been outrun by the very woman he once underestimated. No screaming, no slaps. Just a woman standing firm and a man with nowhere left to hide the truth. This silence, not to hold on but to end it. That night I packed without slamming a single drawer. No dramatic suitcases, no angry playlists. Just me folding Sadie's favorite pajamas, the yellow ones with faded stars, into a soft blue duffel. Sadie sat cross-legged on her bed, crayon in hand, finishing the picture she'd started after dinner. What are we drawing tonight? I asked gently. She looked up and smiled. It's a house, but not this one. It's smaller, but it's ours. I paused. And something in my chest, something clenched for years, began to ease. I didn't tell her everything, but I told her enough. That house. We're going to see it tomorrow, I said. She blinked, then whispered, really, really. Colin wasn't home. I left the envelope on the kitchen counter, the same one he used to scribble grocery lists for me years ago. But this time it held the rental agreement for the new place, my resignation letter from the PTA board, and a single photo of the three of us, him, me, and Sadie, from before. On the back I wrote, you were loved. You were chosen. But you were never entitled. Then I stepped outside. The night was crisp. Somewhere a dog barked down the block. Sadie slipped her hand into mine. Mom, she said as we reached the car. Are we going to be okay? I turned to her, eyes wide, hair messy, still holding her drawing. And I smiled. We already are. I didn't cry until we reached the stop sign at the end of the street. But it wasn't grief this time. It was relief. It was air I hadn't breathed in years. And when I glanced in the rearview mirror, Sadie had fallen asleep, clutching her drawing of a new home. No, it wasn't a mansion. There were no grand promises or shiny finishes. But it was ours. And it was enough. A mother, a child, a new path. No revenge. No confrontation. Just a timely departure, leaving behind everything that once felt heavy. 6 months later, the house wasn't much. 2 bedrooms, creaky floors, and a garden that hadn't been touched in years. But every morning sunlight spilled through the kitchen window like a promise. Sadie named the tomato plant Rosie. And for once she didn't ask where her dad was. I'd found a job at the public library, part-time, cataloging new arrivals, helping seniors figure out ebooks. It paid less than half what Colin used to bring home. But I hadn't missed a single bedtime. There were days I'd still freeze when I saw couples at the grocery store, the way they leaned into each other, casual and careless. But then Sadie would tug my sleeve, asking if we could get peaches instead of apples this week. And just like that, I was back. I never reached out to Colin. Not once. And surprisingly, he didn't either. No late-night texts. No, I miss her calls. Just silence. At first it hurt. Then it felt like a blessing. Because silence meant space. And space gave me room to remember things. How I used to sing while cooking, how I once dreamed of starting a podcast about motherhood and memory. How I loved words, not numbers. I picked up an old notebook one afternoon. Its cover was bent. Inside were messy, half-written essays about forgiveness and failure. I stared at one line I didn't remember writing. You can grieve the life you thought you'd have, and still be grateful for the one you're building. Sadie's laughter echoed from the yard. She was trying to teach Rosie the tomato plant how to sit. And I realized I didn't need revenge. I didn't need Colin to apologize or for life to punish him. I had my daughter. I had my voice again. And I had a home, however small, that didn't smell like betrayal. Healing isn't loud. It arrives on quiet Wednesday mornings through a child's smile and a tomato plant given a name. There was a letter on the doormat. Not an email, not a text. An actual envelope. Handwritten. Postmarked from Chicago. I stood in the doorway, coffee cooling in my hand, staring at it like it might bite. Sadie was still in bed, curled around her stuffed rabbit. I slid the envelope open. 2 pages. His handwriting. Janelle, I know I have no right to ask anything of you. But I've been thinking of Sadie lately. I've made mistakes, and I've hurt you more than I can ever make right. I'd like to see her. Even once. Only if you think it wouldn't undo what's been healed. No signature. Just a number scrawled at the bottom. I sat down at the kitchen table where sunlight kissed the faded linoleum. The old me, the one who stayed too long, who gave too much, she would have called back in a heartbeat. Hoped, bargained, reopened wounds just for one moment of closure. But now I looked at Sadie's drawing on the fridge, a stick figure with glasses holding hands with a little girl. No dad in the picture. Just the two of us. And a tree with big red apples. I folded the letter once. Then again, slid it back into the envelope. No tears. No shaking hands. Just a calm that felt like the ocean after a storm. I didn't know if Colin was sorry or if he just missed the idea of being a father. But what I knew, what I finally solidly knew, was that Sadie didn't need a ghost who loved her in theory. She needed presence. Patience. Someone who showed up every morning with pancakes and silly songs. And that someone was me. I didn't need to answer him. Some wounds, silence is the only way to protect what's still good inside. Sadie asked me a question that morning that caught me completely off guard. Mama, she said, mouth full of cereal, do all daddies leave? I didn't answer right away. I knelt beside her chair, wiping a bit of milk from her chin with the corner of my sleeve. No, sweetheart. Not all of them. She looked at me carefully like she was reading my answer in my face, but mine did. I took a breath. A slow, steady inhale. He did, I said softly, but that's not your fault. Not ever. She nodded, too wise for her age, too quiet for a 5-year-old who used to sing into her spoon. Then she asked, do I have to miss him forever? And that's when I felt it. That ache, that wound I thought had turned to scar. It pulsed just for a moment. But I stayed with her gaze. Held it steady. No, I said, you get to decide who takes up space in your heart. If you want to remember him, you can. If you don't, that's okay too. Your heart is yours. She leaned into me, her head resting on my shoulder, breath warm against my skin. You're enough, she whispered. And just like that, something heavy slid off me. Not because someone else lifted it, but because I finally set it down. We spent the morning building a pillow fort. Sadie decided it needed a no boys allowed sign, then amended it to only boys who know how to braid hair and say sorry. I laughed. Not because it was cute, though it was, but because it felt like the kind of rule I wished I'd had years ago. Later, as she napped curled under a quilt my mother had made, I opened my laptop and filled out a form I'd bookmarked for months. Graduate application, early childhood counseling program. It asked for a personal statement. So I typed once. I thought healing looked like forgiveness or forgetting. But now I know it's living fully, quietly, honestly. It's walking forward even when no one is watching. It's raising a child with both hands open. And I hit submit. I don't know what the future will bring. But for the first time in years, I don't need to know. I've chosen myself. The rain that night didn't last long. But it left behind that damp earth smell I always associate with starting over. Sadie and I took a quiet walk around the park near our place. She held my hand tighter than usual. And I didn't let go. We strolled past the path lined with stone pavers. A few stubborn red maple leaves clung to the roots. "Mama, can I take this to school?" She held up a leaf pressed and brown-edged like an old letter. "Of course," I said. "Maybe your teacher will help you press it. Or maybe I'll just keep it in my lunchbox," she grinned, "so it won't be lonely." I smiled not just because it was sweet, but because something inside me had quietly shifted. I no longer woke in the middle of the night from old dreams. I no longer searched his name in emails. I no longer thought I heard his voice outside my door. I stopped asking myself, if I'd been prettier, less tired, more forgiving, would he have stayed? I didn't need that answer anymore. All I needed was right here, my feet on the ground, my daughter's hand in mine, the sound of late autumn wind in the branches above us. When we got home, Sadie helped me water the plants. She gave a little extra to the smallest pot and whispered to it, "Grow strong. Mama says little things can be mighty too." I stood still, watering can in hand, as tears warmed my cheeks. Not from sadness, but from knowing how far I'd come and where I'd finally landed. I didn't need anyone to see it. I didn't need Grant to regret. I didn't need Blythe to apologize. I had taken my life back, piece by piece, day by day. Through quiet things like returning a library book, brushing Sadie's hair, remembering to water the basil. And maybe that's the point. It wasn't the pain that made me who I am, it was how I rose after it. That night I didn't turn on the lights. I made a cup of chamomile tea, sat by the window, and watched the reflection of a neighbor's lamp shimmer across the lake. I wasn't hoping for tomorrow to be dramatic or different. I just hoped I'd keep oozing calm. And, somehow, I knew I would. In the end, justice wasn't loud. It was the quiet I created for me, for Sadie, for all the days still to come. It's strange, the kind of silence that settles after everything has fallen apart. Not the silence of grief, not the silence of confusion, but the kind that follows clarity. That morning, I stood by the window of my new apartment, smaller, quieter, with sunlight that crept in like a whispered reassurance. There was no grandeur, no sweeping view, just a few potted herbs on the sill and the scent of cinnamon from the bakery below. And I felt peace. Not joy, not triumph, just peace. Which, for a long time, had felt unreachable. I had spent so many years trying to hold things together, to keep appearances, to avoid being the one who caused a scene. But there comes a moment when silence becomes more painful than any scream. I didn't scream at the end. I didn't beg. I simply stepped away and never looked back. People often ask me now, "Don't you wish you had found out sooner?" Or, "If you had confronted them earlier, would things have been different?" Maybe. But healing doesn't come from perfect timing. It comes from finally choosing yourself even when the damage is already done. I see that now. There were signs. So many signs. The late nights. The whispered texts. The way his voice hardened when I asked soft questions. The way her eyes darted away during family dinners. But I wasn't ready to believe, because believing meant letting go of everything I'd worked so hard to preserve, even if it was already breaking under my hands. Some mornings I still wake up expecting the weight on my chest. Expecting the dread. The old habit of bracing for disappointment. But then I remember. It's over, not forgotten. Just not in control anymore. And that to me is freedom. Some people left without a word. Some with long dramatic texts I never finished reading. And some just faded quietly like steam off a morning mug. I didn't chase them. Not this time. In the past, I would have reached out, apologized, even when I wasn't wrong, offered a coffee to clear the air. But now I let the silence speak. Because the truth is, when everything crumbled, the people who really mattered didn't wait for explanations. They showed up. My neighbor, the one I barely knew, brought soup the night I moved in. Just knocked and left it at the door. Didn't ask questions, didn't stay too long. My cousin, whom I hadn't spoken to in years, called out of nowhere just to say hey. I heard. And I'm here if you need to scream. Even my old piano teacher from high school, Miss Hargrove, the one with the faded blue cardigan, sent me a handwritten letter. She had seen something in the paper. I hadn't realized people still wrote letters. And yet hers was the only thing that made me cry that week. Then there were the ones I had loved, more than I should have. My sister. She called 3 weeks after everything blew up. Said she didn't want to pick sides, said she hoped we could all just move past it. Move past what exactly? The betrayal, the lies. The months she knew and said nothing. I told her I wished her well. And hung up. It didn't feel vindictive. It felt like finally I was learning to love myself more than I needed to be liked. There's something terrifying about choosing boundaries when you've lived your whole life being the peacekeeper. But it's also liberating. Because once you stop fearing the loss, you realize who's truly willing to meet you where you are. The first time I bought a carton of oat milk without checking if someone else preferred almond. I stood in the aisle for 3 whole minutes smiling like an idiot. It was nothing and it was everything. For years my life had been built around someone else's preferences. What they liked, what they expected, what they feared might look bad. I hadn't realized how much of me had gone missing in those small negotiations. The color of a bedsheet, the way I folded the towels, the fact that I loved strawberry jam but always bought orange marmalade instead. Freedom, I learned, isn't always a grand gesture. Sometimes it's hearing your own music in the house. Sometimes it's dancing while folding laundry and not being told you're too much. I started baking again. Not for anyone. Just because the smell of cinnamon and vanilla reminded me I still had something to give, even if no one asked for it. I repainted the guest room sage green. I planted lavender by the front steps. And I let myself wear bright blue even though I'd once been told it washed me out. It was strange at first. To have silence and not fill it. To wake up and not check if someone else had already started the coffee. To end the day without summarizing it to anyone. But then, it started to feel like mine. My time. My peace. My life. And then, something happened. A moment so unexpected it nearly knocked the wind out of me in the middle of a grocery store. There next to the frozen peas stood someone I hadn't seen in nearly 10 years. His name was Owen. And once upon a time he had been the first person to ever tell me I was more than enough. He looked older, but kind. There was a quiet tiredness in his eyes. The kind you earn honestly through grief and trying again. We both laughed nervously when we realized we were reaching for the same bag of frozen corn. And then, silence. Until he said, "Did you ever get around to Paris?" I blinked. That old dream, the one I buried between mortgage payments and gas bills. No, I smiled. But I painted the guest room green. That's a start. Owen tilted his head, smiling with that same softness I remembered. The color of beginnings, he said. We didn't talk about the past, not about why we drifted, not about who we became in the in-between. Instead, we talked about bookstores and how they're harder to find now, and how silence is underrated, and how lavender, when planted right, survives winter. He walked with me to the parking lot. Didn't ask for my number. Didn't offer coffee. Didn't make it a moment it didn't need to be. But before he turned away, he paused. "If you ever get to Paris," he said, "let the light hit your face, let it warm you. That's all I ever hoped for you." And then he left. I sat in the car for a long time. No tears, no music. Just me. Breathing. There are moments that aren't loud. They don't come with closure or fireworks, but they mark you. Like a small pin on a map. You were here, you kept going. You didn't turn bitter, you didn't disappear. I don't know what comes next. But for the first time in years, I don't need to. I chose myself. And that maybe was the real beginning. That night I couldn't sleep. Not out of sadness, but because my mind was full of quiet questions. Not the anxious kind. The wondering kind. Like someone inside me was stretching after a long sleep. I walked to the back porch with a blanket around my shoulders. The stars were brighter than usual. Or maybe I just hadn't looked up in a while. Maisie came out quietly, still in her socks. She sat beside me, resting her head on my arm. "Mom," she whispered, "do you ever miss the way things were I didn't answer right away? Because it wasn't simple. Because the truth was layered. I miss the version of me who believed things couldn't break," I said finally. "But I like this version of me too. The one who knows they can and still chooses to build again." Maisie looked up. "You're brave." I smiled, kissing the top of her head. "So are you. We're both still here, aren't we?" Later I found an old envelope, one I had tucked away in a recipe book I never used. Inside was a photo. Taken years ago. Me on the beach barefoot laughing, holding a paintbrush, not a purse. It reminded me that before I was someone's wife or someone's disappointment, I was someone full of color, so I bought a ticket. Not to Paris. Not yet. Just a train ride. To a town I'd never been. With a tiny art supply store and a secondhand bookstore I'd read about online. I didn't tell anyone. I just went. And on that ride, looking out the window at fields passing like memories, I whispered to myself, "You're not late. You're not broken. You're just becoming." I still come home every day. Still cook dinner. Still fold towels and sign field trip forms. But now I leave room for wildflowers. For detours. For one quiet hour with music and brushes. For me. That's what he never understood. That's what she tried to erase. But they don't get to define the ending. I do, and I chose this. The slow, strong, soft kind of life. Built not from escape, but from return. To myself. Now it's truly the end. And truly a beginning. I didn't need a grand ending, just a quiet one. And in that quiet, I finally heard myself again. Sometimes the greatest healing doesn't come from revenge, but from reclaiming the parts of you that never needed to be explained or defended. When we stop chasing closure from those who broke us, we create space for the life we truly deserve. Because in this world, choosing peace isn't weakness, it's wisdom. If this story reminded you of a time you had to choose yourself, I'd love to hear it. We heal stronger when we share the road.